Part 1, A Silent Plea in the City. A cold morning, a hungry soul. The morning was cold and gray in Boston, where the city never truly rested. The air was thick with the scent of freshly baked bread and hot coffee wafting from a small cafe tucked between towering buildings. People rushed past, their coats wrapped tightly around them, too busy to notice much of anything. Except for one. At the corner of the cafe, near the entrance, a golden retriever sat quietly. His fur, once a bright golden hue, was now matted with dirt, and his ribs pressed against his thin skin. His large, deep brown eyes weren't just pleading for food. They were searching for something far beyond hunger. But no one stopped. He didn't bark. He didn't beg. He simply sat there, his presence quiet, yet unshakably patient. Inside, Emma Carter, the cafe owner, noticed the dog for the first time while refilling the pastry display. She had seen strays before, Boston was full of them, but this one was different. There was something about the way he sat there, as if waiting for someone, as if he had a reason to be there beyond just seeking warmth. He lifted a hesitant paw once, almost as though he wanted to knock on the door, but he never did. And that hesitation broke something in her. A connection that couldn't be ignored. As the day went on, the cafe remained busy. People noticed the dog, some even murmured about him. Looks like he's been on the streets for a while. Poor thing, but it's not our problem. Someone should call animal control. Yet, no one acted. As evening fell, Emma stepped outside to discard some leftover bread. The golden dog was still there, barely moving. His body trembling from exhaustion. Then, he did something that sent a chill down her spine. He slowly stood up, his legs weak, and with careful, deliberate steps, he approached her. He didn't lunge, didn't whimper. He simply reached out and placed a single, cold paw on her hand. Emma froze. The world around her, the noise of the traffic, the chatter of pedestrians, the rustling of leaves, faded into silence. It was just her and him. And in that moment, she understood something. He wasn't just lost. He was waiting. For what? Or who? She knelt down. Her hand trembling as she ran her fingers through his fur. He was thin, his body weak, but his eyes remained strong. "You're looking for someone, aren't you?" she whispered. The dog tilted his head slightly. His expression unreadable. She didn't know why she was so sure, but she was. And that night, for the first time in years, Emma made a decision without thinking twice. "Come inside." "Boy." He hesitated for just a second, then, slowly, carefully, he stepped through the door. A night that changed everything. Inside, the dog curled up in a quiet corner near the fireplace. His body exhausted but relieved. Emma placed a bowl of water and some food near him. She expected him to lunge at it, to devour the meal like a dog that hadn't eaten in days. But he didn't. Instead, he looked at her first. As if waiting for permission. Something deep in her chest ached. "Go ahead, it's okay," she murmured. Only then did he eat, slowly, calmly, as if he had once been trained to wait. And that was when Emma knew. This dog wasn't just a stray. He had a past. A story. And somehow, it was about to become hers. Memories long buried. That night, as Emma lay awake in bed, she couldn't stop thinking about him. She had lost a golden retriever once, many years ago, when she was just a little girl. His name had been Charlie. He had been her best friend. And then, one day, her father had taken him away. "He's just a dog, Emma. You'll forget about him." But she never did. And as she glanced at the golden retriever sleeping by the fire, something about him felt familiar. Too familiar. "It's just a coincidence," she whispered to herself. But deep down, she wasn't so sure. A trail of clues. The next morning, Emma decided she needed to know more. She examined the dog closely while feeding him. That's when she saw it, a faint scar around his neck, as if a collar had once been there for too long. Her heart pounded. "Did someone abandon you?" she asked softly. The dog only looked at her, his silent patience more powerful than words. Later that afternoon, she walked him outside, keeping a loose grip on an old leash she had found. She didn't expect him to lead her anywhere. But then, he did. He walked with purpose, through the streets, past alleys and buildings, as if he knew exactly where he was going. Until they stopped. In front of a small, familiar park. Emma's breath hitched. This was the park where she used to play with Charlie as a child. The dog sat down by an old wooden bench, gazing at the same twisted tree where she had once spent hours throwing sticks for her dog. Emma's hands trembled. "No, it's not possible." She turned to him. "Have you been here before?" she whispered. The dog simply stared. And in that moment, Emma realized. Maybe it wasn't her saving the dog. Maybe he had come back to save her. Part 2, a past that refuses to fade. An unshakable feeling. Emma sat frozen on the weathered wooden bench, her heart hammering in her chest. The golden retriever, this quiet, gentle soul, sat beside her, staring at the twisted tree in front of them, the very spot where she had once played as a child. "It can't be," she whispered, gripping the edges of the bench. Charlie had been taken away when she was 10. That was nearly 15 years ago. Dogs don't live that long. And yet, something deep in her refused to dismiss the idea. She turned to the dog, her fingers trembling as she gently ran them over his fur. "Who are you?" she whispered. The retriever lifted his head, gazing at her with those same brown eyes she remembered from so long ago. A part of her wanted to laugh at how absurd it was. Another part of her felt like crying. Searching for answers. That night, Emma barely slept. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Turning over every possibility in her mind. Maybe he had just belonged to someone else. Maybe she was imagining things because she wanted it to be true. Or maybe fate had done the impossible. The next morning, she decided she couldn't ignore it anymore. If this dog had a past, she needed to find it. She grabbed her laptop and started searching for local animal shelters. After an hour of digging, she found a name that sent a chill down her spine: Hope Haven Animal Rescue. It was located in the very neighborhood she grew up in. And one line in the description stood out to her. Helping lost souls find their way home since 2006. That was the year Charlie disappeared. Emma swallowed hard. Could it be? There was only one way to find out. A shelter with secrets. The shelter was small, nestled between two rundown apartment buildings on the outskirts of Boston. The moment Emma stepped inside, the scent of clean straw, dog food, and faint antiseptic filled her nose. A kind-looking woman with silver-streaked hair stepped forward. "Welcome. Can I help you?" she asked. Emma hesitated before speaking. I think this dog may have come through here before." The woman, Eleanor, glanced down at the golden retriever beside her. The moment their eyes met, Eleanor's expression changed. A flicker of recognition. "Oh," she breathed. Emma's stomach tightened. "You know him, don't you?" Eleanor's face softened as she knelt in front of the dog, gently cupping his face. "Well, I'll be damned. Lucky, is that you?" The dog with two names. Emma's breath caught. "Lucky," she repeated. Eleanor nodded. "That's what we called him when he showed up here a few years ago. He had a collar once, but it was too worn to read the tag. He never really stayed in one place. He always seemed to be searching for something. Emma felt a lump form in her throat. How long ago did he come here? She asked. Eleanor sighed. I'd say 8, maybe 9 years ago. Emma did the math in her head. If Charlie had been taken away when she was 10, that would mean he had spent 6 years missing before appearing here. She shook her head. That's impossible. Dogs don't live that long. Eleanor placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Honey, sometimes life has a way of surprising us. She disappeared into the back room, returning moments later with a small, worn envelope. We kept something that was found with him. Emma took it with trembling hands and carefully unfolded the contents. Inside was an old metal tag. The letters nearly faded away, but she could still read them. Charlie. Her vision blurred with tears. No way. She turned to the dog, her dog, and he simply wagged his tail, as if he had been waiting for her to figure it out. Emma covered her mouth with her hand, her chest tightening. You found me. After all these years. You found me. And then, for the first time since she was a child, she let herself sob into his fur. More than a coincidence. As they drove home, Emma couldn't stop glancing at Charlie in the passenger seat. Everything she had known, everything logical and scientific, told her this shouldn't be possible. But it was. Charlie had somehow, against all odds, made his way back to her. It had taken years. But he had never stopped searching. She reached over, gently placing a hand on his fur. I don't know how you did it, buddy, she whispered. But you never gave up on me, did you? Charlie blinked up at her, his tail thumping softly against the seat. Emma smiled through her tears. I promise, I'll never let you go again. And for the first time in 15 years, she truly felt whole again. Part 3, Unraveling the Mystery. A heart full of questions. Emma sat on the living room floor, Charlie's old tag clutched tightly in her hands. She had spent years trying to forget the past, trying to let go of the pain of losing him. Yet here he was. Older. Weaker. But still Charlie. Still hers. She glanced at him, now curled up beside her, his golden fur rising and falling with each peaceful breath. How did you find me, boy? She murmured, running her fingers gently through his fur. He didn't answer, of course. But something in the way he looked at her, the way he had always looked at her, made her feel like he understood everything. And then, another thought hit her. Charlie hadn't just survived. He had been searching. For her. But how? And why now? Emma took a deep breath, her heart pounding with both fear and hope. She needed answers. Retracing the steps of the past. The next morning, Emma made a decision. She would find out what happened to Charlie after he was taken from her all those years ago. With the old shelter record and metal tag in hand, she sat down at her laptop and started digging. Where had he been for the past decade? Who had taken care of him? How had he survived long enough to find his way back? As she searched, she kept stealing glances at Charlie. It was almost as if he knew she was trying to solve his mystery. And, just like always, he waited. Patient. Silent. Watching. That's when she noticed something strange. On the back of Charlie's old tag, there was a barely visible engraving. The letters were worn, but she could still make them out. It's never too late. Emma's hands trembled as she traced the words with her fingertip. Too late. For what? She whispered. Her gut told her, this was another piece of the puzzle. A forgotten name. A new clue. Finally, after an hour of searching, she found something. In the old shelter's records, a name appeared. Howard M. Walker. A man who had adopted Charlie years ago. Emma's heart pounded. She had never heard the name before. But he had been listed as Charlie's caretaker for nearly 7 years. 7 years. 7 years where Charlie had been waiting. But for who? And why had he left? Only one way to find out. She grabbed her keys, took one last look at Charlie, and whispered, "Let's go find the man who kept you safe, boy." A face from the past. The address led her to a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. The house was old, its paint peeling, the garden overgrown. Emma swallowed hard, her hands gripping the steering wheel. She took a breath. Then another. And then, she knocked. Seconds passed. Then, the door creaked open. An elderly man, his face weathered with time, peered out cautiously. "Can I help you?" he asked. His voice raspy. Emma cleared her throat. "Are you Howard Walker?" His eyes narrowed. "Who's asking?" She hesitated. Then, stepping aside, she let Charlie take a step forward. Howard froze. His breath hitched. His hands shook. And then, in a voice so soft it was almost a whisper, he said, "Lucky?" The truth about Charlie's missing years. Emma and Howard sat at the kitchen table. Charlie curled up at their feet. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Howard exhaled deeply and began. "I found him wandering near a gas station about 7 years ago. He was thin. Weak. Looked like he'd been searching for something." Emma listened intently. "He had that old collar, but no one knew where he'd come from. Animal control was gonna take him in. But I couldn't let them. He was different. He wasn't lost. He was waiting." Emma's heart ached. She already knew what he was going to say next. "Waiting for someone," she whispered. Howard nodded. "I took care of him. Fed him. Kept him safe. But he never really belonged to me. Every night, he'd sit by the door, staring at the street. I could see it in his eyes. He was looking for someone." Emma swallowed past the lump in her throat. "Why did he leave?" Howard sighed, rubbing his hands together. "One morning, I woke up and he was gone. I searched everywhere. I waited. But deep down, I knew. He had finally decided it was time." He looked at Emma then, his eyes gentle, but knowing. "He left to find you." Emma blinked back tears. For 7 years, Charlie had been waiting. And when he finally felt ready, he had come back. No matter how far. No matter how impossible. He had found his way home. Emma reached down, stroking his fur. "You never gave up on me, did you, boy?" she whispered. Charlie simply sighed, resting his head on her lap. And in that moment, Emma knew. She hadn't found Charlie. He had found her. And he had never once stopped believing that he would. Part 4, A Love That Never Faded. A story that needed to be told. Emma sat in silence, Howard's words still echoing in her mind. "He left to find you." She looked down at Charlie, now sleeping soundly by her feet. His golden fur rose and fell with each peaceful breath. He had waited. For years. And when he was ready, he had left behind the safety of Howard's home, because he still believed in her. Emma swallowed the lump in her throat. "But how?" she whispered. "How could he have known where to go?" Howard leaned back in his chair, his weathered hands gripping his mug of coffee. "Dogs don't think the way we do, Emma," he said. "They don't need maps or directions. They find their way with their hearts." Emma blinked back tears. "So you knew that he'd leave?" Howard sighed. I always knew he wasn't mine to keep." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the afternoon sun filtered through the window, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Finally, Emma took a deep breath. "Thank you," she said softly. Howard gave her a small, knowing smile. "You don't need to thank me," he murmured. He was never lost. He was just finding his way home. A promise to keep. The drive home was quiet. Charlie sat in the passenger seat, his head resting against the window, watching the world pass by. Emma reached over and gently scratched behind his ears. "I don't know how you did it, boy," she whispered. "But you found me." His tail thumped softly against the seat. Emma felt something shift deep inside her. For years, she had tried to forget about Charlie, tried to bury the pain of losing him. But all this time, he had never forgotten her. And now, she had a promise to keep. "We're home, Charlie," she murmured as they pulled into the driveway. "And this time, I'm never letting you go." Rebuilding what was lost. Over the next few weeks, life changed for Emma. Charlie had a new bed, a warm home, and a family once again. But even with all the comforts of home, one habit never changed. Every evening, as the sun set, Charlie would walk to the front door, sit down, and stare outside. Waiting. For what? For who? Emma didn't know. Until one day, she finally understood. A ghost from the past. One evening, Emma sat beside Charlie on the porch, watching the stars appear one by one. She ran her fingers through his fur and sighed. "What is it, boy? What are you still waiting for?" Charlie didn't move. Didn't react. He just kept staring at the street, as if expecting something. And then, a sound. A faint, hesitant knock at the front door. Emma's heart stopped. Charlie's ears perked up. She swallowed hard and slowly stood, her legs feeling like lead as she walked toward the door. When she opened it, she sucked in a sharp breath. Standing on the doorstep was a man she hadn't seen in over 15 years. Her father. The moment of truth. Emma's body tensed. She hadn't spoken to him in years. Not since he had taken Charlie away. And now, he was standing in front of her, his eyes filled with something she had never seen before. Regret. Charlie stood up slowly, stepping beside Emma. For a long moment, her father simply stared at the dog. "I can't believe it," he whispered. Emma crossed her arms. "Why are you here?" she asked. Her voice colder than she intended. Her father sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I heard about the dog. About how he found you again." Emma clenched her jaw. "And?" He looked at Charlie again. "And I needed to see for myself." His voice broke slightly. "I needed to know if he still remembered me, too." A lifetime of unspoken words. Emma's chest tightened. "Why do you care?" she asked. Her voice shaking. "You were the one who took him away. You made me believe he was gone forever." Her father exhaled sharply, running a tired hand down his face. "I know." His voice was raw. Honest. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was teaching you how to be strong, how not to rely on things you couldn't keep." He looked down at his hands. "But I was wrong, Emma. And I've spent every day regretting it." Emma's vision blurred with unshed tears. She didn't know if she could forgive him. But before she could say anything, Charlie took a single step forward and wagged his tail. A bond that couldn't be broken. Her father's breath caught in his throat. Slowly, he knelt down, his hands shaking as he reached toward Charlie. "You remember me, don't you, boy?" he murmured. Charlie sniffed his hand, his tail wagging just a little more. Then, to Emma's utter shock, Charlie took another step closer and gently nuzzled her father's palm. Emma covered her mouth, her heart shattering into 1,000 pieces. Because in that moment, she knew. Charlie had never held a grudge. He had never stopped believing in love. And maybe it was time she learned to do the same. A love that never fades. That night, Emma sat beside her father on the porch, Charlie lying peacefully at their feet. For the first time in years, they talked. Really talked. They didn't erase the past. They didn't pretend things hadn't been broken. But they started something new. A chance. A second beginning. And as Emma ran her fingers through Charlie's golden fur, she realized he hadn't just come back for her. He had come back to fix what had been broken. He had come back to bring them home. And this time, for the first time in forever, Emma finally believed in forever. Because Charlie had proved it was real all along. A lesson in love, loyalty, and second chances. This story isn't just about a lost dog finding his way home, it's about the power of love, patience, and redemption. Charlie never gave up. He searched for years, proving that love isn't just a fleeting emotion, it's a bond that can withstand time, distance, and even heartbreak. Emma had to learn to forgive. Sometimes, the hardest thing we can do is let go of past pain and allow healing to take place. But love, even when lost, can find its way back in ways we never expect. Her father finally faced his regrets. In life, we don't always make the right choices. But it's never too late to make things right, to mend relationships, and to let love back in. This story reminds us that some connections are unbreakable, whether it's between a dog and his owner, a father and his daughter, or two souls meant to find their way back to each other. Now, we want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced an unbreakable bond with a pet? Have you been given a second chance with someone you thought you lost? What part of this story touched your heart the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved you, hit like and share. Subscribe for more emotional and inspiring animal stories. Turn on notifications so you never miss a heartwarming tale. Because in the end, love always finds its way home.